Today we'll talk about the story of the most famous flight that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, and how, even if the pilot was experienced, his stubbornness could kill the whole group. Welcome to Mystery Tales, and let's get into it. It all began in the year 1950, when there were many articles in American newspapers talking about the disappearances of many planes and ships between the east coast of Florida and the western coast of Bermuda Island. The articles spoke in detail about the disappearance of planes, ships, and hundreds of civilians in this area, and all these disappearances were of unknown cause. In the year 1952, a magazine specialized in strange natural phenomena placed imaginary lines in the areas where these accidents occurred. These areas extended between the coast of Miami in Florida, the island of Bermuda, and the islands of Puerto Rico. The three lines were in the shape of a triangle, so the name was inevitable. It became known as the Bermuda Triangle. This name made people curious, but afraid of this area. In today's video, we're telling the story of the most famous disappearance in the Bermuda Triangle, a story about an experienced pilot, but his stubbornness killed his whole crew. This is the story of Flight 19.
On December the 5th, 1945, 5 U.S. Navy Avengers took off from a Florida airbase on a routine training mission.
Chatter between the planes, but nobody ever really communicated with them after that. They sent rescue planes out looking for them later that night, and one of them disappeared.
But something went wrong. The tower suddenly received inexplicable radio messages. In a panic, the pilots reported they were totally lost.
He's still actively pursuing, what happened to him.
Their story began on December 5th, 1945. 5 U.S. Navy planes were emerging from an airport called Fort Lauderdale on the east coast of Florida. The squadron consisted of 5 planes, which had 14 crew members. The crew was on a routine training mission. They were accustomed to it, and this was not the first time they had done this routine mission. But 2 hours after the start of the flight, the planes were supposed to be on their way back to the airport. But the squadron commander reported that he was starting to think there was a mistake, especially when both compasses had a malfunction and were showing incorrect directions. After informing them of the malfunction, the communication station tried many times to communicate with the planes in order to determine their exact location, but unfortunately, without success in these attempts to communicate with the fleet. Although they were able to hear the communication between the pilots within the fleet, they were fighting with each other about their location. Everyone thinks that they are on a different path, and none of them is able to determine exactly where they are. It took 4 hours after the last heard communication between the planes for the U.S. Navy to estimate the plane's approximate location, an area 200 kilometers north of the planned route of the flight. So, a reconnaissance plane named ST-49 was sent to confirm the presence of the planes in this area. At first, this reconnaissance had a very normal line of communication with the control towers, but suddenly the communication between them was cut off, and the plane disappeared from the radar in a very strange and sudden way. An hour after that, there was one message they were able to hear between the pilots in Flight 19, and that was the last message they were able to hear. It was a failed communication attempt between 2 of the planes on Flight 19. And by now you might say, so what? Few planes disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, but the secret was in the investigations that took place after the planes disappeared. The first thing was that this squadron of planes was led by 4 students. The 5th was their supervisor, Charles Taylor. The students were the ones who lead the fleet, and Charles was just supervising. In the beginning, the flight was proceeding on its normal course. It departed from the Fort Lauderdale from eastern Florida and then flew north towards the island of Grand Bahama. At that time, Charles felt that the students were flying in the wrong path, and he started leading the fleet himself. And after reviewing the aircraft tapes, it showed that Charles was confused between the area of Grand Bahama and the area of the Florida Keys. And in the communication tape, he said, "My compasses are out, and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure it's the Florida Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." In other words, he thought he was in this area, but in reality he was in this area. The question here is, How is an aviation supervisor with Charles's experience confused between these two areas? Before Charles went to Fort Lauderdale, he was stationed at Miami Station. And the routine missions from Miami Station were usually over the Florida Keys. And before he was at Miami Station, he was stationed at Key West at the islands of Florida Keys. So it was his first time flying over the island of Grand Bahama. It seems that this was the first time because he was a new transfer to the station, and what confirmed this theory was that in the radio communications between him and the communication station, he was referring to himself as MT-28, and this name was his previous name in the stations before that, where the M stands for Miami. As for his current name, it was supposed to be FT-28 for Fort Lauderdale. This shows the state of confusion he was in. This is what made him lose confidence in his compasses, and he began to believe what he saw from the window, broken islands. Then I am definitely in the Florida Keys. This is what caused a disagreement and a major verbal altercation between him and the other student pilots who were on the planes with him, because they said, "We believe our compasses and we are in the right place," and he was convinced that he is in another place entirely. And at this moment, Charles gave them a direct order. "We'll keep flying north," because from his point of view, they would reach Florida. But in reality, they were flying deeper into the water. There was no land nearby. He also refused to go west, because from his point of view, he would enter the Gulf of Mexico, and the planes would run out of fuel before reaching land and fall into water. But in reality, if he had listened to what his crew said and turned to the west, they would have reached Florida. As time passed and the sun began to set, the clouds increased and visibility was very poor, and they entered into a storm. At this time, they all began to be angry with each other. Then Charles gave another order: fly in close formation, and when one plane drops to 10 gallons of fuel, all planes will land together. He thought, if they had to emergency land in water, then they will do it in close formation, so it would be easier for the rescue teams to find them. Later, he gave another order that said, "I suggest we fly due east until we run out of gas. We have a better chance of being picked up close to shore." From his point of view, flying east would get them closer to the western shore of Florida, but in reality, they were going deeper into the Atlantic Ocean. And that was the story of Flight 19 disappearance in the Bermuda Triangle. And as you can see, there is nothing supernatural about it if you look closely at the details. The whole thing was caused by the confusion of the supervisor Charles and his inability to listen to his crew. Do you think there's supernatural phenomena happening in the Bermuda Triangle? Let me know down in the comments section. This was Mystery Tale, and see you in another video. Bye.